I'm Kevin O'Brien from UC Berkeley, and I'd like to welcome you all to our conference on producing knowledge about China. I'd like to get the conference going quickly and hear what you all have to say, so I'll be very brief. I guess first I'd like to thank you for braving our elevators and working your way up here. Earlier this morning, people had to walk up the steps, and if I have to ask Jeremy if Kevin Rudd has any extra money, we'd be glad for him to share some. To share some of it with us in our humble facilities here. I was in a township in Yunnan that was destroyed in an earthquake in 2006. Just a 5.8 earthquake knocked down 1,400 buildings. And of course, it's been completely rebuilt since 2006, often as remote a corner of northeastern Yunnan as you could possibly imagine. I guess we're hoping for the same sorts of things here, but not during this conference, I suppose. This building has been declared seismically unfit, I think 8 or 10 years ago or something like that. Okay, I want to welcome all the paper presenters here to Berkeley, including those who have come for the first time, those who have been here many times, and even a few who were underfoot as graduate students not all that long ago. It's really great to see you all in one room for a conference that Tom Gold, Wen-hsin, and I started thinking about going on about 5 years ago. This is actually the third of 3 clusters of activities. The first was a big conference on the environment a couple of years ago. The second last year was a year-long set of activities on new media in China. This is the third of a cluster that began when Terry Lotz of the Luce Foundation came through a while back and told Wen-hsin, Tom, and I at a breakfast over in the city that Luce was thinking just as hard about new directions in China studies as many of us here on campus were. Since that time, this particular conference has gone through various permutations, but it's always had a focus on the future of China studies. The role that we as faculty play in it, how training graduate students is changing, and particularly the part that institutions outside China have in pushing China studies forward. I'd like to thank the Luce Foundation for generously supporting this series of events, and also all of our audience members for coming to share in what I hope will be, and I trust will be, I'm confident will be, a stimulating couple days of discussion. As you can see here, we will be recording for all who wish to be recorded and who signed the media form. What that means is if you're in the audience, there'll be a microphone floating around, and you'll need to wait for the microphone to reach you if you'd like to have your comments recorded. Okay, I'll turn it over to Wen-hsin now.
Good morning, along with Kevin. Let me welcome all of you to this conference sponsored by the Luce Foundation for our extensive discussion about producing knowledge about China. And we are undertaking this from the perspectives of social sciences disciplines. The origin of this conference, as Kevin mentioned, went back to at least 5 years ago. And it was a couple of us getting together, reflecting upon the way that we continue with our own research and teaching within the existing framework of the China studies field as we have come to know it. As is well known, the academic history of this field of studies of late imperial and contemporary China from a social science perspective does not go back very long. I suppose in some ways, for North America in particular, we would probably date it to the mid-20th century. So for those of us who intellectually, professionally grow up within that framework, so to speak, that starting with the 1990s, just as we were relishing the kind of academic tradition that we have built for ourselves, we begin to wonder whether the subject or the object of our research, namely China out there might not have eluded us in a significant way. So in my own line of work, namely teaching the history of China, modern China, the way that it came upon, or it comes up, tends to be that each year, from the early 1980s to the present, as I offer this undergraduate lecture course on modern and contemporary China, that when we get to the last week of the semester about China of the recent 2-3 decades, that initially, of course, I was comfortable about simply adding a new chapter to the ending, but without changing, without going back to retell the story of late imperial or modern China. But then over time, increasingly, the question that came up in my mind is, can we tell the same historical story about China if this China is transforming itself into a new subject? Thus, a transformed or an innovative modernizing China require a new set of historical narratives. Will it suffice? That is, if historians teaching undergraduates simply add a new chapter to the very end of it without going all the way to the very origin, say 1800, for instance, to reorient the expectations of our students. So I suppose in some ways, the first inspiration going into the organization of this conference is the whole issue about whether old storylines and new subjects might fit together. The second consideration had something to do with new questions. Students come to us these days saying, well, I'm not particularly interested in China as such, but I am interested in developing a future career that will have a large East Asian component, either with work relationships in connection with China or about decision-making within which an understanding of East Asia will be of relevance. So we have students coming to us with new concerns, new aspirations, new questions, instead of the good old-fashioned set of expectation that we had back in the 1970s or even in the 60s, namely simply wanting to become China experts, specialists, academic scholars, and researchers. So that's a second consideration. And the third consideration had something to do with the whole question about new participants in the field of China studies with regard to our understanding of China. Our students are far more familiar or receptive, for instance, to the works done by journalists, by writers, by financial analysts sometimes, than to those of us who write in this, shall we say, highly specialized academic genre. So there are new voices, new participants, and then also people, of course, begin to write, to read about scholars who are based in China and who write about China in English. So all of these are considerations. And then here we are convening a conference so as to engage in some of these reflections, cutting across disciplinary divisions. Now, I should say that for the social sciences perspectives, given the nature or constraint of the three organizers, we are only able to bring together or to organize panels with emphases on history, political science, and anthropology/sociology. That does not necessarily in itself exhaust the entire spectrum of, say, social science approach to China studies, nor does it exhaust the content of China studies or knowledge about China that's been taking place within the academia. Nonetheless, we hope that with this conference as a way to get the conversation started, we might be able to move along in a cross-disciplinary fashion with regard to the way that we think about ways to approach China. So I'm very happy to report that the panels which are being put together are going to be run in the fashion of roundtable, which means with presentations anchoring conversations, but with the bulk of our time hopefully devoted to conversations, exchanges, rather than presentations. And the second point is also that we made it a deliberate or an effort to make sure that it's going to be presented or represented today and tomorrow on these panels scholars who have been raised on different academic traditions, who come from different regions of the world, and who are informed by different sets of questions and perspectives with regard to interactions or understandings of China. So with these remarks as a way to anchor ourselves or to explain ourselves about what we are trying to do, I am now happy to turn the podium over to Professor William Kirby of Harvard University, who will be our moderator for the first panel.
Thank you very much, Wen-hsin. Let me...
Sorry.
WG.
Kevin reminded us that we should mention my colleague, Professor Thomas Gold, is unable to attend. He's on his way. He's on board an aircraft carrying him to South Korea at this very moment, but he sends us his regards.
Well, let me just start by thanking Kevin and Wen-hsin and Tom for bringing us all together. And for me, always a pleasure to be here at the Institute of East Asian Studies at UC Berkeley. And to follow up what Kevin was saying, to be here in this building, a place that is itself a center historically of producing knowledge about China. And I think it's probably arguable that pound for pound, square meter per square meter, I'm not sure about cubic meter, but square meter for and person for person, this place has produced more than any other place, and from top to bottom. This top floor here, and those of you of an earlier generation will remember the great library that used to exist down at the bottom, which has now been removed. And so in some sense, it has literally a towering presence, not overlooking Zhoujingshan, but and the gateway to China, but also over our entire field. And it is, one has to really thank the taxpayers of the state of California and the University of California for preserving this building, the taxpayers for paying no taxes whatsoever, and the university for cutting the budget so regularly that this building, I think, will be here forever, at least until the next earthquake or until Wen Jiabao comes to oversee its reincarnation. We have a very good panel on historiography and area studies, and we will get to it right away. It's not actually, it's really a very West Coast panel, it just occurs to me, so it's not really massively geographically disparate, but in any event. It's not, that's right. Anyway, we will start with Madeline Dong's paper on Dialogic History and Production of Knowledge about China, Reflections on the Work of Joseph Levinson. Madeline?
Thank you. The problem that I've been thinking about is this almost unavoidable bias involved in cross-cultural knowledge production. I say almost unavoidable because bias is almost human nature, and we have to acknowledge that historians of China have made a wide range and very serious efforts to deal with this problem. But in spite of all our trials, we still face this situation that the West produces theory and China provides data, and that situation has not changed. Even today, China scholars still read more works about and produced by our colleagues working on the Western world. And in graduate student training, our students working on China or Korea or Japan still very often take a minor field in Western history. I had a minor field in French history in addition to Japanese history. So, what do we do with this situation? And befitting the professional habit of a historian, I looked backward to, with the contemporary problem, I looked backward to look for an answer or a way to think about this problem. And what I found was actually Joseph Levinson. And when I tell people, most of the time I don't have to justify my research projects to people. They hear it, they say, oh, that's very interesting. This time, everyone would say, oh, that's interesting. Why? Here is why. One reason is, unlike today, with very few exceptions, that our work, the work that we produce, doesn't get read by our colleagues working in other parts of the world. Levinson's work was read by people outside of the China field, which means that people working on other parts of the world were using his understanding of China to enlighten their way of dealing with their own problems in that part of the world. And secondly, Levinson had this ambition that I don't think we have realized, and it's a very relevant ambition for today. He said that he hopes by bringing China into a universal world of discourse, a historian would help to unify the world on more than a technological level. I see a world made when an understanding of Chinese history without violence to its integrity and individuality, and an understanding of Western history reinforce each other. I think that's highly relevant in today's world. And the third reason for me to reread Levinson is sort of a personal one. 20 years ago, I first read Levinson in a graduate seminar, and the professor happened to be Joseph Esherick. And he turned to me and said, so, what do you think? The only thing I could say was, I'm sorry, I don't understand anything in this trilogy. That was a humiliating moment, and thank you, Joe, for not failing me in that seminar. So, rereading Levinson after 20 years, he has been a puzzle to me for all this time. What did I find? The first thing I found is that he has been seriously misinterpreted, misread, misunderstood. It almost seems that we're so used to comparing China and the West, or China and Japan. When a different kind of comparison and framework is presented to us, we don't see it, 视而不见. And secondly, I was very intrigued by his methodology, which I will explain in a minute. I'm not implying that Joseph Levinson had solved all the problems that we face today, or that this is a simple revival of Levinson's projects or agenda, but using him as an entry point to maybe have a refreshed view of thinking about our dilemmas. Contrary to the conventional understanding of Levinson being the representative of the intellectual history branch of the Fairbank School of Western Impact and Chinese Response. Levinson's work, in fact, had a very crucial third dimension, which is his understanding and reflections on his Jewish identity, the framework of Jewish history and Judaism. So, his work, first of all, was not based on the Western impact and Chinese response. It is also on response, but it was a Jewish history framework of crisis, a cycle of crisis and responses. And the difference between the Levinson crisis and response framework and the Fairbank impact and response model is that Levinson's, the kind of crisis and responses Levinson talked about are not purely external. He actually stresses the internal crisis and motivations as much as outside challenges. So that's the first foundation of his historical perception. Secondly, he believed that survival is unconditional and non-negotiable. The survival, he means not just the physical survival of a nation and people, but also their cultural traditions expressed through daily life practices. So in Levinson's understanding of history, there's no separation between the people and their identity. And this is very different from the Fairbank school as well, because Fairbank emphasized change, convergence, and modernization, and the foundation of Levinson's understanding of history is the survival of the singular. And there's no separation between survival and cultural identity. And so on this foundation, most of the most important conclusions that he drew about Confucian China's modern fate came from a series of comparisons, and I will just give 3 examples. Before he set out to compare China and Jewish history, Chinese history and Jewish history and Judaism, history of Judaism, he established a comparability between these 2 traditions. The comparability came from the relevant positions between the Jewish tradition and Western mainstream, and Chinese tradition and Western mainstream. And so it was not just a static relationship, peripheral relationship between these traditions and the Western mainstream, but also a one that was both traditions were constantly threatened by an increasingly cosmopolitan world. So that's where he established the comparability between these 2 traditions. And then I give you 3 examples. One, that famous concept, museumification, that Levinson used to talk about the death of Confucianism in China. In his trilogy, what we see is he compared China and Greece. But in his notes, reading notes that's housed in actually UC Berkeley's library in the Levinson archive, he did a comparison between Judaism and the Greek tradition first and used the concept museumification. And his conclusion was that Judaism is a live tradition and the Greeks are museum keepers. And Greek traditions were used or has been used by modern Europeans, but the Greeks themselves were not active producers of the Greek tradition anymore. And his conclusion from that comparison is that Judaism is a living tradition practiced by the Jewish people. And China, in his view, was that China experienced a death of the kind of Confucianism that served as state ideology and the kind of Confucianism that trained the scholars who served in that state. But the Chinese, via communists, actually enabled themselves to reclaim that tradition. And so the Chinese were becoming museum keepers themselves, and there was the opportunity for them to reclaim that tradition and decide how to use it in a way that they see fit. So you see that he started from the same concept of museumification, but reached different conclusions about these three different traditions. And secondly, the flow of direction of flow of authority of tradition. In Rabbinic Judaism, because of the absolute authority of the Torah, the authority of the tradition always flows forward from the ancient times to the contemporary time. And in Confucianism, after the fail of Kang Youwei's new text, radicalism, the tradition, the flow of direction was toward the back. So you use modern ideas to justify that actually Confucius also had made this point thousands of years ago, rather than using Confucianism to justify for example, socialism. And the third comparison he conducted was oneness in action and thought. He believed that there was almost a same kind of emphasis on the oneness between thought and action in Judaism and in Confucianism. And he used this a kind of an obscure scholar, Liao Ping, as an example. Liao Ping spent his whole life studying and teaching Confucianism, and he believed that he acted in a perfect Confucian way. But in Levinson's opinion, Liao Ping actually represented the death of Confucianism, but instead of the life of Confucianism. And why? Because Levinson, although he started with this philosophical concept of action to examine both Judaism and Confucianism, he used the internal logic of Judaism and Confucianism to evaluate Liao Ping and a Jewish individual, instead of using a standard from Judaism to measure Liao Ping. If Liao Ping were a Jew, he would be a perfect Jew, but he was a Confucian scholar, so he was a failed Confucian. So what we need to emphasize is that Levinson, the result of Levinson's comparison is difference rather than similarity or the sameness. Okay, I have 3 minutes left. I'll be done by then. And I would argue that Levinson appeared to be wary of models in an academic age overabundant with models. I quote, "Throughout the work, my principal tool of analysis was not the social science model, but metaphors." He stressed repeatedly that comparability is not analogy, while the former implies a limited juxtaposition of characteristics, the later involves a much wider range of similarities. He explains, quote, "I meant not to force identities, but to recognize relevancies. These were comparisons, not analogies. One of my methods throughout was to isolate comparable entities, then probe them for failure in analogy. And they seemed to me to throw light not on Chinese history, but on the purpose of history writing on this subject in this day." What can we learn from Levinson? And the idea that I got is, I think what he was practicing was dialogic history. Some scholars have mentioned that Levinson had an empathy toward the Chinese, but I think instead of empathy, what his approach is actually inclusion, which is a cornerstone of the philosophy of dialogue. The difference between empathy and inclusion is that empathy means that you move yourself over into the framework of other people. For example, China-centered history. We become Chinese and adopt their perspective, which you end up still produce a limited historical view. But instead, inclusion means an extension of your own concreteness. And I will explain this later if we have time for discussion. Dialogic history, how is it different? What distinguishes it from other things? So it's different from comparative history, for example, that practiced by Toynbee. Toynbee didn't have a huge impact in Europe. He had a larger impact in the US and still has a huge influence in China. So dialogic history would be different from the kind of universal paradigm that Toynbee tried to develop. It's also different from Weber's approach to history, that Weber tried to fit the whole world into the model that he developed from Europe. I'm not saying that there are no valid points in Weber's theory, and Levinson didn't say that either. And this is also different from the postmodern approach of history, because in dialogic history, it's absolutely not true that only a people can study their own history and other people cannot touch it, because you're always outsider, you're always in that, you're always orientalizing other people. Because Levinson actually came from a very different philosophical, very strong and different philosophical from the mainstream philosophical tradition that we have seen that served as the foundation of the postmodern historiographical approach. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Madeline. And we will go through each of our presentations and then open things up for commentary. And for those of you who are sitting outside, I guess you're good. You've already figured out that you can come in and find seats, because there are seats on the inside. We now turn to the death and longevity of the revolution, and Professor Esherick.
Thank you very much, Bill. Thank you, Wen-hsin, Kevin, all the organizers of this. And nice to be back to Berkeley again, and especially to follow a talk about Levinson having, of course, come to Berkeley some, whatever it is, 35 years ago or something like that, to study with Joe Levinson, and now to have him recalled by one of my own students who clearly now understands him far better than I did. It's very nice to be part of this panel. The topic of this talk is "The Revolution is Dead," and there's another part of it, but we'll leave that out for now. And a problem that I wanted to deal with is that as historians, and I guess this is the history panel, we're always telling stories. That's what we're all about. There is a narrative that we are trying to construct. Our particular small research projects have small narratives within them, but they tend to be linked to usually some kind of meta-narrative that is the larger story that gives sense and purpose and meaning to whatever we're working on. And for a very long time, the narrative of modern Chinese history, the meta-narrative of modern Chinese history, had been very clear and been undisputable. It was the story of the revolution. That was what everything was about. Intellectual history was about the death of Confucianism and about intellectuals' discovery of Marxism. Economic history was about the high-level equilibrium tract, or the involution, or the failure to develop capitalism, and instead bureaucratic capitalism and other failed forms that led inevitably to a search for socialist solutions. The political history was about the failure of various political forms. You wrote about Hoosier, you wrote about the weakness of Chinese liberalism and how inevitably you would search for some more authoritarian mode. The story, the inescapable story, was always the revolution. And now, as Wen-hsin's opening comments indicated, that story becomes much more problematic. China itself does not seem to be exactly enamored with revolution. People who go to China and visit China, and the China that our students know about, is the China of skyscrapers and cell phones and internet of one sort or another, however constrained. It is the story of globalization. It is the story of explosive economic growth. Nobody's quite looking at China as incapable to develop its economy or having a culture that somehow is incompatible with modernity. And the revolution, if anything, seems to have been a detour or a big mistake or some little period that happened in between the empire and the current transformation that we don't need to worry very much about. And the history that is now produced and the papers that are now given at the Association for Asian Studies or whatever are about the global and the local or political culture or popular culture, more like, or modernity, material culture, gender, of course. And one tends to look in vain at the AAS program for anything about the Chinese Revolution. In one case where I was looking at, I finally found Chengdu Xu on the program, but he was talking, or it was about cross-cultural theorizing and transnational networking. So even when you think you found the revolution, in fact, you've just found another transnational topic. The nature of this transformation was nicely brought home to me when I was reading or rereading the introduction to Leo Li's wonderful book on Shanghai. Shanghai studies are, of course, inescapable, especially at Berkeley. But Leo discusses how in the 1970s, when he started the book, Chinese studies was preoccupied with rural villages. Well, I don't think Chinese studies is preoccupied with rural villages anymore. And I certainly don't think that Shanghai is neglected anymore. And in part, this is due to very logical and laudable and understandable things. Shanghai is a great place to do research. It undoubtedly has the best and the most accessible archives and libraries. If you want to give advice to a student to what you want to do for a topic, Shanghai is a very good place to send them because you can be pretty sure that the archives won't be suddenly and summarily closed on them. And it's a good place to build a career. But there's also a degree, and I always like to take an opportunity such as this when I visit some other campus to bring my disagreements with the local authorities to the fore. And Wen-hsin and I have been having a kind of background debate about just exactly what the narrative of modern Chinese history is. So I thought I might as well bring it to the fore here. And Wen-hsin has another narrative that is Shanghai-based and is about the market and is about gender and is about the self, and it's not about politics and so on and so forth. And there's also always the suggestion in this that those who are still interested in the revolution are, as she put it at one point, embracing the revolution as the solution to all China's problems. And that there is a politics behind talking about the revolution. That if you talk about the revolution, that you're somehow advocating for the revolution as the solution of Chinese problems. And what I want to suggest here is that it should be possible to talk about the importance of the revolution and the inescapability of the revolution without necessarily being painted with the brush of being just another one of those 1960s Berkeley radicals that can't ever quite get over it. So that is one side of it. Another thing that has struck me about a lot of the recent historiography is the displacement not only of the socialism of the revolution, but the displacement of the nationalism. The tremendous popularity of works on collaboration by Parks Coble, Po-Shek Fu, and especially Tim Brooke in what I think is far and away the most sophisticated of these. And the assertion that there is, and here I shift to Prasenjit Dwara, some greater authenticity that is to be discovered, that one can find anchored in the individual and authenticity, and summarizing a very a complex argument here that Dwara finds in some of his Buddhist organizations in Manchuria, sponsored by the Japanese, which was somehow more authentic, and in people found a true, genuine personal development larger than the nationalism, which then becomes a construct imposed on them by the state or by political forces, and is somehow artificial in a way. One sees as well, and one has to confront as well, some of the more popular books on the revolution. And I think here now in particular of Chang and Halliday's Mao biography. This has all been carefully analyzed. Tim Cheek has written very perceptively, I think, on that. Now I think most specialists would see considerable flaws in that work. But what struck me about it above all was the degree to which the whole revolution was essentially being created in Moscow. And by Stalin. And it was all a product of a conspiracy and manipulation. And all agency was left to something other than the Chinese people themselves. And that has seemed to me to be a considerable problem for our understanding of modern Chinese history. I would add that in Jay Taylor's, I think, quite laudable biography of Chiang Kai-shek and the Generalissimo, one sees pretty much the same story. Generalissimo was an extremely able and much misunderstood, and Taylor has done, I think, a wonderful job of resurrecting some of that. But whenever he turns to the opposition, then they too are always being manipulated and guided by Moscow and so on. And especially in a time when, after Chang and Halliday, Mao is being paired with Hitler and Stalin, to try and say that, there was both something important and maybe even some accomplishments of the revolution, puts one in dangerous political company. And one ends up perhaps being associated with just, those few old crazies out there like Arif Derlich and Moss Roberts and, maybe Mark Selden and, of course, Joe Esherick, formerly known as. But what I would simply want to argue here is that the revolution is still very relevant to the story of modern China. One, simply because it happened, and history should not be just a crude linkage of what's going on in the present to some phenomenon of the past. That part of what we do as historians is try to get students to appreciate a past which was markedly different from the present. And in this case, to understand the way in which throughout 20th century China, revolution was what everybody thought was the solution, from Liang Qichao to Sun Yat-sen, to Chiang Kai-shek, to Mao. Remember that Chiang himself was defending the revolution, and the communists were counter-revolutionaries because revolution was assumed to be the good thing and the way that you solved problems. And in an age in which revolution is basically sort of what terrorists do, it's important for students, I think, to understand that there was another age in which people thought that revolution was a solution to problems. They may have been absolutely wrong, and they certainly were a hell of terrible things that happened as a result of this, but we need to understand that it did happen and it mattered. But finally, I try to make an argument at the end of this paper that the revolution did matter even for the present. That a lot of the human capital, a lot of the infrastructure, a lot of the origins of the small township and village enterprises that were some of the early stages of the economic transformation of China, all of those were products of that revolutionary project. And that seeing the current transformation of China as entirely the product of the repudiation of the revolution is not to understand the full picture. And I always take great pleasure in reading my colleague Barry Naughton's work, very insightful work on the Chinese economy, who always tends to make that point. And finally, to cite another work that I like a great deal, Wen-hsin's work on private life. And I still think of the people writing on contemporary China, the ones I tend to enjoy most are the anthropologists, because they seem to be talking about a China that I understand better. And Wen-hsin talking about the transformation of private life, in part not just as a result of the market forces of the present, but of course, as a result of new forms of sociability that came out of collectives and collective life, and what was going on in the schools, and what was going on in extracurricular activities, and the way in which new forms of sociability came out of those products of the revolution as well. The point very briefly, once again, is that I hope we can get to a point where even as we understand and study all these other wonderful and fascinating and well-documented things of urban China and popular culture and cities and modernity, that we don't forget the revolution. The revolution mattered. And I would hope that it's not just old Berkeley radicals who are saying long live the revolution that are trying to make that point. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Okay, Levinson mattered, the revolution mattered, and they both matter still. And we'll hear about area studies as Tim Cheek from UBC will integrate the study of China with the biological sciences, according to his title.
Not the biological, the disciplines. This is there you go, the biological sciences. The revenge of the fruit fly. I understand that the term in German, I don't speak German, but is the love life of a ladybug. Any German speakers? Is that the similar model? A colleague of mine
Never
who's
heard that one.
Well, according to Herr Dr. Professor Julian Derkis, he reckons it's that way. This panel has given us, in the papers, when you get a chance to look at them, some reflections, one could say, on the ontological, the epistemological, and the political economy aspects of what we do. Each paper addresses all of these things, but in particular, Madeline's paper touches on the ontological, the meaning of it, and with Levinson's very great example for us to deal with what does this work that we do mean. Joe Esherick I would assign you the epistemological focus, because the answers that we get are shaped by the knowledge that we get is shaped by the questions that we ask, and with the meta-narratives. And I will touch in my time on the political economy, the short form of which is you get what you pay for. And what are we paying for? This conference has been called together to address the challenge, to articulate a rationale for what it is that we are doing. Hopefully, a persuasive rationale for the knowledge that we produce and the ways that we find congenial to express our understandings. The title is drawn from the reference to, at least in Australia, it was, when you said you're doing research, was you're doing the very good primary research on the left wing of a fruit fly. No one else knows, but I know, right? And so it's the joke about it's such taking discovery knowledge to the extreme comes at the cost of integration and application of that knowledge. And the thesis that I'd like to make or suggest for today, as I tried to answer the question, what is it that we are doing, and why do those of us who do China studies often find ourselves not in full felicitous conversation with our disciplinary colleagues, is that I think we might think about calling what we are doing, I think what it is what we are doing, is comparative contextual analysis. So I'll make a bid for that. In the paper, I review some of the woes of area studies, which I will not dwell upon, since we are probably broadly familiar with them. But I will take it as a given that if you're bothered to turn up for this today, that you think that perhaps China studies, in particular and area studies in general, is not doing all that it could, or is not being appreciated all that it should. So our problem, that is the Rodney Dangerfield status of area studies in the academy, is due, I think, to the political economy in which the interdisciplinary scholarship and more fundamentally the teaching are considered secondary to research. So I say that the fundamental problem is not area studies, it is that interdisciplinary scholarship and teaching are second, poor relatives to discovery scholarship. Those of you who have been doing your homework on SOTL, Scholarship of Teaching and Learning, and with the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Education Teaching will know that this is the Carnegie Talk, which we will come back to. Amongst the agents of this repression of area studies as a form of knowledge about China, from disciplinary advocates to academic administrators and journalists who take their word for it, the most troubling enemy, I think, of area studies is ourselves. We buy the, quote, research is the only real scholarship paradigm that valorizes laboratory and monographical studies, doubts scholarship that is not first and foremost primary research, and which disdains teaching as a lesser art and a distraction from real scholarship. And this is a social fact that has been studied by many, and particularly the folks at the Carnegie Foundation. At this point, let me relate my own experience. As that other teacher who shares my modest goals might have put it. I started off as a student at Harvard, and at Harvard I acquired student habits so that I felt ashamed of manual labor, such as teaching, in front of all those scholars who were busy writing books and articles. I felt researchers were the only truly smart people in the world, and that workers, peasants, and teachers in general were rather pathetic. But when I joined the revolution, and I joined the workers, peasants, and teachers at the Colorado College, I gradually became familiar with them. Then, and only then, the research and disciplinary research values taught to me by the research schools began to undergo a fundamental change. This is what I call a transformation in feelings, a change over from one class to another. Long live the revolution. Okay, so maybe the status differential between area studies and disciplines in the university or teaching versus research is not the same as social revolution by the poor, nor perhaps as Colorado College Jinggangshan, though it is in the mountains. But the real point of this whimsy with Mao is to say that, in fact, I have not undergone this transformation of feelings. 我还有思想问题. Right? I have not overcome my old self. And I've not overcome these attitude problems, 态度问题, about what parts of my work are important and that would contribute to such that we can contribute to a real change in the political economy of knowledge production that creates the low status of China studies and area studies. So without any further fooling around, I put it, is part of the problem our dedication to research in the disciplines or in a linguistically rigorous and off-putting pseudo-discipline of sinology? Is part of the problem our dedication to that at the expense of interdisciplinary integration of specialized knowledges and the building of communities of teaching and learning? Now, how do we make sense of all this? The Carnegie folks, Boyer, what's Boyer's first name? I forget. Ernest Boyer. The 1990 book, Scholarship Reconsidered, he proposed a fourfold model of knowledge production and circulation. And I quote, that the work of intellectual life include not only the scholarship of discovering knowledge, but also the scholarship of integrating knowledge, the scholarship of applying knowledge, and the scholarship of teaching. I suggest that this is a useful way for us to cast what it is that we do and might help us ask the political economy question about what is it that we and our universities are paying for. And I think it would help us to defend something like what Jeremy Barmé calls the new sinology. This is because in order to capture the richness and diversity of our subjects of studies, we include aspects of integration and application of knowledge, and we share the interdisciplinary cast of undergraduate education. What is the case then for area studies? If we cast it in the form of the Carnegie 4 scholarships, it helps us articulate it. Some of what we do in China studies is discovery scholarship, information not previously available or current in Anglophone scholarship and public writing. But some of it integrates various disciplinary perspectives. Several of us here, if you look at our books, they're at least in 3, 4, sometimes 5 different Library of Congress catalog numbers. You know, JQ, DS, HS, HX, DS, even I've got a P in there somewhere. Some integrating, and more frequently, the relationship between area studies and the disciplines has been, and this comes under the Carnegie 4 of integrating, I think, knowledge, as a challenge to the disciplinary perspective or approaches that Madeline spoke to about our assumptions and that we're all familiar with. And to challenge the assumption of theory in Western disciplines. In the arresting parlance of my colleagues at UBC's Cultural Psychology program, they say area study seeks to redress the limitations of social theory based on weird people. That is W-E-I-R-D, research based on an N comprised mostly of the study of people in Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and developed societies. The paper came out in Brain Research. As area studies people, I think we should all keep up on that. Some of us seek to apply that knowledge, the third category in Carnegie. In public intellectual writing, take, for example, the China Beat blog, a particularly good one, and of course in business consulting. And finally, we teach. But I think in our teaching, we find that students most welcome our broader topical courses rather than economics of sociology of X discipline of China, more interested in what's going on in China, or what I think Kevin O'Brien in his paper has usefully distinguished is our work contributing to understanding China or to improving political science, right? Both are laudable contributions. But my simple point is that the university system is currently set up to pay for one and not the other. The Then we talk about the benefits are not only in terms of the content, what we know about China, but methodologically. One can make the argument that area studies is corrosive of scholarly hubris, since we are forever outside our comfort zone in one disciplinary speciality. Area studies models listening skills, when done well, in order to work. It also translates between cultures and societies and provides some diplomatic skills and opens the doors to human enrichment. Now, I particularly struck, Edith Grossman has a new book called Why Translation Matters that I found, at least I've ordered the book, but reading a review of it, look what she says about translation. We all do a certain amount of translation. And translation is more than the straight linguistic textual, but we are translating knowledge areas, right? And culture areas. What she says, translation represents a concrete literary presence with the crucial capacity to ease and make more meaningful our relationships to those with whom we may not have had a connection before, enabling us to see from a different angle. As nations and individuals, we have a critical need for this kind of understanding. Amen. There are weaknesses to area studies, but I won't review them now. Finally, so what is this comparative contextual analysis that I evoked? At the UBC, at the Institute for Asian Research, we're going through our periodic angst and self-review, and we're wondering what is it that we do. And so we've been all working on this a bit. I'd like to suggest that area studies is one way of organizing local knowledge of a significant group of humans defined by culture, language, and shared history that exists on a continuum of scholarly knowledge. And if I was a PowerPoint person, we would have it up there. But I trust your powers of imagination. Imagine. Left or right, you can choose. I don't want to favor one. On one side, Chinese for Chinese. In the middle, Chinese for non-Chinese. And on the other side, English/French, because I'm in Canada, right? So in the middle is area studies knowledge, where people who are not writing they're writing in English, Chinese for non-Chinese, they learn a lot about China and they report back. That's what we do, okay? The more I work with my colleagues in China, and I'm sure for all of us, some of us it's just our lives, others of us it's been a transition that we've had, that I was raised in the China-centered scholarship of the late 70s and early 80s, and China has moved from being the object of my studies to the partner of my work. So I work with Chinese colleagues rather than on them. I studied Deng Tuo, I work with Xu Jilin, right? That's the shift, and it's terrific, okay? So when I'm in China speaking Chinese to my colleagues at this and that university, I realized I'm doing super area studies, right? It's all Chinese all the time, right? In other words, I'm just in a department talking to historians. And then I go over to talk to the political scientists. I'm just doing disciplinary stuff. Because it's disciplinary work. Chinese for Chinese is just disciplinary work in China by Chinese for Chinese. They're just doing their work. Area studies is somewhere in between. On the far other side is disciplinary work, which is the standard disciplines that we know in English or French in the language of the Western country that they're happening in. So what's the point? The point is that much of our work is at the bridge between area studies and disciplines. That's what I'm calling comparative contextual analysis. And that joins the skills of local knowledge, language, and in the field experience with formal disciplines. What's the value of that? I'd like to think that comparative contextual analysis can do good things. One definition is that comparative contextual analysis seeks to generate theoretical questions that can be empirically tested in different cultures and can shed light on shared processes at work in disparate circumstances. So in other words, the goals of measurability, testability, and comparability. These comparative questions, however, are generated inductively from a detailed study of the cultural context and temporal context of specific cases. Comparative contextual analysis is not new, but it does seem to be in disfavor in the university, and particularly amongst political scientists and comparative sociologists, and I'd be glad to be shown wrong if the news is better than I fear. Theorists tend to view area studies as mere empirical work, as we all know. And for their part, area studies scholars frequently dismiss what they view as empty theorizing by disciplinary-based comparativists. However, without the challenge of explicit, intelligent, and rational theory, analysis runs the risk of antiquarianism, unquestioned assumptions, and a lack of comparative value. This is a point several people have made, one by Liz Perry in the Popular Protest and Political Culture volume. She did a nice review of political science on just these issues. Comparative contextual analysis should offer compelling arguments, interesting questions, and lines of research about the nature of a topic or the issues for the case studies on which it builds, and should suggest helpful methodologies, compelling arguments, and helpful methodologies for extending the scope of the topic to other areas. That's the long and the short of it. And the final coda is, what is to be done? I don't know. Thank you. No.
Keep going.
Yeah. But I just couldn't resist.
He really doesn't know.
No, but that doesn't stop me talking. What comes out of the scholarship assessed, and the reason I review and return to the Carnegie efforts is, in the second book, Scholarship Assessed in 1997, they came up with 6 goals for standards for assessing scholarship, which they maintain were based on some field work of them studying what happens in the natural sciences and in the social sciences. And I think the list, I'll read it out real quick, but it's pretty obvious. They try to operationalize it. And certainly the problem we have is, I feel like every time I talk about this stuff and the Carnegie stuff, I feel like, what is it? What's so funny about peace, love, and understanding? The old rock song. It's like, or John Lennon with his, if you want to end war, you've got to make peace as interesting and challenging and fun, right? It's exciting, right? So the problem with everything other than highly disciplinary peer scholarship is that nothing is as good as the peer review system for convincing everyone that you have certified knowledge, right? So when it comes to teaching, when it comes to interdisciplinary, and when it comes to applied policy stuff, we have to generate something that is convincing to promotion and tenure committees, the political economy to which I am referring, right, in order to promote purchase of different kinds of knowledge. So 6 criteria that are helpful: clear goals, adequate preparation, appropriate methods, significant results, effective presentation, reflective critique. They go over these with nice little operational things on it. If you go and say, okay, I want to change at my school what we're doing, and when we're trying to promote with the promotion and tenure folks at UBC, that's what we have to work with if we're going to have that transformation of our feelings. Thank you.
Well, we have 3 terrific presentations to start with. I'm going to offer a couple of comments and then open it up to the audience for your collective comments. But I think if we each one has really looked back as a way of assessing where we are today and where we may go forward. And if you look at Madeline's or read Madeline's paper and heard, it would be worth thinking also collectively about the work of Levinson. How it matters today. It's so common that graduate student reading lists are made up of things published in the last 5 years without really deep reading or discussion of some of the classics in the field. And Levinson and Schwartz in their day were really 2 who were so deeply trained in Western as well as East Asian philosophy, something that is almost impossible, not impossible, but more impossible to find among non-Chinese today. It'd be very interesting to have your comments on that. In Joe's presentation, so Joe doesn't believe that 没有苏联就没有新中国. He has a different point of view, and it talks really about the changing. And it is there are many things that are absent in the annual meeting of the Association of Asian Studies, but this is clearly one of them, and one that was so central to it in earlier generations. And it's one of those things when one thinks about it. Tim talked about the centrality of partnerships that we now have, all with our Chinese colleagues. And this is one field, I think, in which it arguably, that's never been quite the same case, in part because it couldn't be in the period of the 1960s and the 1970s, the way Chinese historiography could not be really seriously written at that time, or some of it was imported, but not a great deal. And it's interesting that most Chinese historiography on the revolution as a period, if you look at the Civil War from 1947 to 1949, 1950, written either on the mainland or on Taiwan, a lot of it on the mainland is really in the realm of Dangshi and a little bit in the realm of social history. But the large majority of that really tries to explain the outcome is in the area of military history, in the area of military political history, in the area of military political diplomatic history, three areas in which the American Academy, already in the 1960s, was no longer seriously engaged in one way or another. Try and find after F.F. Liu or whoever it was, or who's a Chassin, the French general, a serious military history of the revolution, and yet it was a revolution that was won in conventional warfare on battlefields, not in villages. But it's in some sense, right now, if one were to re-engage this, as I think would be a very reasonable thing to do, it's not an easy thing to do, again, in partnership with China because of the way in which serious history on the revolution of certain forms is not possible, even though there's radical reevaluation of many aspects of the Republican period, of certain parts of the early period of the People's Republic, and so on, but not of the fundamental revolutionary narrative. And it would be worth commenting on that. Last thing, maybe just to throw out for discussion on Tim's presentation is, I think the question of the intersection of teaching and research is always one that people have strong views on. And as a one-time dean, I remember that the assessing and rewarding of teaching is always the most difficult thing to do, but an essential one if you're going to have a serious undergraduate enterprise, even in a research universities. I think it isn't it's much more true in the research universities that it isn't taken as seriously than it is, and in the arts and sciences part of research universities, than in the professional schools of research universities, at least in certain areas. If you look at the role of teaching in law schools and promotion, or in business schools, or in some other, it's taken comparatively much more seriously in this realm, and these are areas in which area studies is now moving, or has moved, but is now more permanently ensconced than before. But I had one thought as it occurs to me is, what you think of, where do the best graduates, not the best, but where do the graduate students and the scholars of the future mostly come from in terms of their inspiration? We know, for example, there are statistics that the people who go on to the great programs in biomedical science and so on come disproportionately from the small liberal arts colleges, who inspire and have greater mentorship, even if they don't have the great laboratories or the research rodent facilities of the major research universities. And in our field, in some sense, one should wonder if that's also true, because first of all, our laboratories are much less expensive. And the teaching ethos of the large research universities is one less likely to inspire the undergraduate who first comes to this field through an exciting course, and so, than the great liberal arts colleges, which are the distinguishing feature of American higher education. I don't think there's any serious data on this that I know of, but even anecdotal discussion might be worth beginning. Now, enough of that, enough of me anyway, and let us open it up to questions and comments. And if individuals would identify themselves as you wish, and then our commentators will feel free to respond. Please. Wait a minute. This is all recorded by Golanju. So we need to get it down exactly. Please.
So I'm Li Zhan, anthropologist from UC Davis. My question is more also a commentary on the question of revolution. I really like your analysis, but I'm trying to think about that. Whether we can ask a slightly different question in terms of a revolution. So I guess maybe we can ask the questions: how and why the language of narrative, the language and narrative of revolution has been constantly now pushed back to the back burner, if not completely buried today. But rather than seeing that as a sort of matter of fact, but seeing that as a political strategy in a move. Because if you look at contemporary China today, the language of reform and development has pretty much replaced, to a certain degree, the language of revolution. And nowadays, the new, Hu Jintao regime proposes this socialist harmony, right? 和谐社会. It's very much at odds with the language of revolution. So what I'm suggesting is to look at this shift itself as a problematic of inquiry, rather than saying, yes, revolution is still relevant, but to look at why we see the shift today and what's the implication. And also, despite all this pushing back, as anthropologists, we do research in everyday life. You see at different junctures, revolutionary languages and repertoires constantly kind of come back in homeowners protesting. Some people have looked at that in Shanghai, the invoking of 国际歌, right? They're singing those things, and a lot of revolutionary sort of memories and the language. So I'm just trying to kind of put a little spin on that and see whether we can look at that from a different angle. So thanks.
So, Joe, before you answer, let's take a couple more comments and then come back to, yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Hans Stemmler. I have two questions. One for Professor Dong is, you didn't mention that in your presentation, but in the paper you quoted a lot from Martin Buber, Between Man and Man and so on, as a reference for both for Levinson's views on Judaism and on dialogical action and so on. And I was wondering what his role was. I mean, was he a reference for Levinson himself, or is it your tool to understand Levinson? And another question for Professor Esherick is whether I wasn't sure whether the neglect of the revolution is a problem of a choice of a research object or a choice of methodology. It seemed to me, sure, in North America it looks like no one is doing that stuff anymore, and everyone is focusing on consumption, commerce, on the blue ocean instead of production, politics, and the yellow soil. But at least to some extent, it looks like the kind of surprising exceptions you quote, where the revolution still plays a role, is really based on a choice of object, because anthropologists just do cultural, social history. So therefore, they're prone to argue that this kind of history plays a role. And so the kind of the new methodology which people, including people present, are suggesting, which Madeline Dong alludes to in the first paragraph of a chapter, where there's a social and cultural turn in history, does that not also play a role? And would there not, if we look into other quarters, especially in anthropology, but also maybe the Tsinghua group on oral history, or oral history research on the revolution in China, done in Germany and France, we would just find that kind of work, which is work on the revolution done with a new methodology.
Okay, one more comment before we go back to our panelists. If not, then let us go to the panel. Madeline, would you like to start? And then
Sure. Martin Buber, yes, I mentioned him as in my paper, and yes, Joseph Levinson cited Martin Buber in his trilogy. It's difficult. I searched the Levinson archive at Berkeley. I need to do what I read is the part of his notes on Judaism. I need to do a larger scale research on his archive, which are large number of boxes of unorganized materials and handwritten, very difficult to read. It's hard to figure out his reading list on Judaism, but I believe that he was reading widely because he was giving talks at Berkeley at that time on Judaism, and he had a plan to write a book on Jewish identity. And that outline of his next book was published in the commemorative volume called choice of Jewish identity. So a lot of my understanding of his reflections on Jewish identity came from there. So what I'm doing now is a colleague of mine, a very famous actually scholar on Jewish thoughts. He's read that piece, and he became so intrigued by Levinson. He's reading the trilogy, and he's helping me figuring out where Levinson got his inspirations and ideas about Judaism. What we can be certain is that maybe we'll never find out Levinson's reading list, but nonetheless we can see where his philosophical inspirations and genealogy comes from. So I think it's and we all know that Levinson repeatedly quoted Whitehead's remark, "A traveler who has lost his way should not ask where am I." What he really wants to know is where are the other places. He has got his own body, but he has lost them. And if you exchange the man into history, then you can see that this really is another way of saying what Martin Buber, Bakhtin, and maybe to some extent Rosenzweig were saying. So he definitely was grounded and in the conversation with other thinkers along similar lines.
Joe?
I think unquestionably there is a high level of politics in the bearing of the revolution. Now, obviously in China, they desire to find harmony rather than class struggle and so on. But also, and to some degree, picking up on a point that Bill made, but also disagreeing maybe a little, it's not a particularly good career choice if you're a Chinese scholar in China to, take the Chinese Revolution as your research topic. It's the archives are problematic or closed. The jinqu that you can't go into are many. They're unpredictable. It's much easier, much less problematic. For many years, it used to be that if you're really a skilled historian, you went into ancient history. And the further you stayed away from the 20th century, the better you were. It's the smart, and it's kind of the dull ones that went into party history, because at least they could count on getting a job somewhere and repeating the party line. But I would say, and here disagreeing with Bill a little bit, there are people like Shen Zhihua and Yang Kuisong and Gao Hua, who I think are doing very good, very well-informed work on party history. It tends to be highly diplomatic, internal documents, but they're accumulating an enormous amount of stuff. And one of the interesting things is they're kind of producing their own private archives that they are making quite widely available to scholars. So there are people who see an opportunity here and who are not shying away from this, and who are insisting, often political motives, though largely critical, in keeping this history alive. As to whether I'm talking about sort of choice of research topics rather than methodology, I think it is largely the former that I am talking about. But I think the methodology thing is relevant as well, and partly again it's related to the point that I've just raised. Since China opened up and since archives opened up, and we have to constantly remind ourselves that, in spite of the centuries that Western historians have been doing archival research, Chinese have been doing archival research, and Chinese scholars have been doing archival research really only since the 1980s. And until that time, with the exception of a certain amount of opening of the Qing archives and publishing them, Chinese archives, were not open in the Republican period. They weren't open in the early PRC. And so the opening of archives has sort of changed the whole framework. But some archives are open and some are not. Urban, Republican, commercial archives are open. And so to the extent that the methodology is going to stress archival research, it's rather natural that you're going to go there. Oral history is another question, and the moves recently to, I think, much more sophisticated forms of oral history than what was done before. Needless to say, when I was working on The Boxer, I was working on a lot of oral histories that were done early, but that's a rather different kind of oral history, and you almost need the original transcripts to be able to read through it and not be prey to the agenda that the people collecting the history were following. We all know the degree to which memory has been so highly structured and constructed that the perils of oral history in China are many, and we're all trying to work through that problem. And if you lead that problem over towards the revolution, the perils there are even greater.
Before I turn to Tim, just want to note, to follow up, I agree with you entirely on Chen Zhihua, Yang Kuei-song, and this level of work. And it's interesting that one of the most interesting places of research on any aspect of the history of the People's Republic is then encapsulated into what they call their Cold War research project at East China Normal University. A remarkable thing that studies 50 years of history, but it has produced remarkable works on what you might consider revolutionary history or Sino-Soviet relations or all kinds of things, and is about as open a place for contemporary history as you can find in China. Certainly the only place where I've seen a portrait of Zhao Ziyan to be found in China today. And the other thing is worth noting when one thinks of, for students here, one of the most suddenly open places, not over the last 20 years, but particularly over the last several years now, is Taiwan. And the massive opening of the archives. You may think Chen Shui-bian was a crook, but he was very good for historians by opening up everything he could about Kuomintang, and naturally. And so revolutionary change there, as it were, was helpful. And now Tim's Tongshui, Lin Manhong, is Guanzhang of Guoshiguan there. And it is among the most open and interesting archives in the world. Tim, any comments that you would wish to make?
I'll await the opinion of the masses.
All right. So Mary Gallagher next.
I have a comment or a question about studying the revolution. And I actually teach the revolution when I teach classes on Chinese politics. I mean, I start out and we probably spend about a third of the semester doing pre-reform modern Chinese history, even though I'm a political scientist. And it was interesting to me because I taught this class at the same time that Ken Lieberthal taught the class at the University of Michigan, that Ken started with 1979, whereas I started with 1850, although we're different generations, and he should have been the one going farther back. But so one of the comments I have is, isn't this just a normal sort of generational divide between people who entered the study of China at different times? And for people who, like me, were born during the Vietnam War, we have no connection to, our political identity in the United States has no connection to the Chinese Revolution or to the Cultural Revolution, for that matter, because our experience with China is generally from the 1980s on and from Tiananmen Square, and I first went to China in 1989. So I think that my inclination is to think we should be studying that period more. We should be studying the 1980s more. The 1980s has kind of been forgotten in our study of Chinese history and Chinese politics. Yashen Huang makes the same argument about the economy. And so maybe this is just more about different generations. We enter China at a different period, and we feel things have been forgotten based on our own experiences. The other argument I think about why the revolution has been more de-emphasized, perhaps, is simply that, and I point this out to my students when we study China now, and particularly comparing China to the Soviet Union, the reform era in China is now as long as the revolutionary period. And this makes the revolutionary period just seem less relevant to the study. I think for political science, this has been good in the sense that you see people now going back to the Republican era and doing dissertations on the Republican era in political science, which wasn't the norm previously, and also breaking down these political boundaries and looking across periods, so Republican to the early communist period, or 1979, and then looking over pre-reform and post-reform. And I guess also it seems that in China too, and Bill was at a conference that I was at last summer at Renmin, it was the 60th anniversary conference. The whole conference from the Chinese side seemed to be making the same exact argument that the 30 years of reform could not have happened without the 30 years of revolution. So it seems that this is not something that's really been forgotten in China, and it's a very relevant debate in China right now because it's related to how does the Chinese political system address issues of social inequality and social injustice that have come out due to some of the consequences of reform.
Jose, before we're going to take two more comments and then come back, but just to follow up on what Mary, Wen-hsin would be next, please. At this conference at Renda, there was an elderly Renda professor who had been on the Renda faculty forever. I mean, since before it was founded, it seems. And he gave this remarkable paper as to how the suffering of the first 30 years was a necessary and almost prescient foundation for the prosperity of the last 30 years, and how the people just needed to suffer for national security and other reasons, and it was really quite something. Wen-hsin, and then Peter, and then we'll come back, and then we'll take 4 comments. Okay. Yeah. Sorry.
Thank you, Bill. I see Joe smiling in the most congenial way. Joe has raised many interesting points, and I will not try to respond to all of them at this point. I would simply like to say that this is a panel that, as a collection of presentations, raised very interesting and important questions about how we read the classics or revisit the master narratives of the 20th century, of our field, which have engaged the endeavor of great talent and many people with commitment, with faith and value, all of that been committed, been associated with the building of the field. So Madeline opens up interesting dimensions there, that is through the rereading of Joseph Levinson, 20 years apart, how that from a somewhat different perspective, that is situating ourselves as we are today, the practice of reading could have been performed differently, even if we are going over the same text. So going from there, I think I would simply like to follow up on this one observation or coming up with questions. Namely, it's interesting how that Joe draws dichotomies between revolution and Shanghai. These things are not symmetrical. Revolution stands for one thing, and Shanghai, in the most basic way or form of it, it's about space. It's about image. In other words, it doesn't preclude anyone looking at Shanghai to discover that there are workers on strike, and these are workers functioning within urban context. In other words, the point that I would like to make is actually a methodological one. Namely, over the course of the 20th century, we tend to privilege historical narratives that place emphasis on temporal sequence. So we follow the trajectories of biographies, of storytelling, of storylines, but increasingly as a result of global interdependence and heightened sensitivity about connections through space, spatial attributes between the local and the global, that it opens up a new interpretive or research angle for historians, which essentially forces us to take far more seriously the issue of spatial attributes within complex settings, as well as the study of images, non-textual materials for purposes of historical research. So it's completely, I think, acceptable from left-wing perspective without denigrating the contribution or importance of revolution, that one examines the materialized forms of economic relationships and their discursive expressions, culturally informed discursive expressions, and doing so from a critical perspective. So what I would like to say in this connection, and to link up on several of the comments which have already been made, is what is it then that when we think about our 20th century historiography with the revolution as the central subject, what is this revolution that we have been studying? That is, the revolution as being constructed by the historiography, as opposed to the broader issue of how, from today's perspective, this revolution could be reevaluated, studied, and then perhaps, as Zhang Li was suggesting, it doesn't require old-fashioned revolutionary means to produce quite revolutionary consequences in real-life context. So, but Joe, I mean, there are many more issues that we'll take up later on. Thank you.
Okay, you can't answer yet. Peter Gries, and then John.
Peter Gries. I was struck during the three talks that about the sort of relationship between the production of knowledge about China and the production of identity, and the silence in the three of your talks about your identities as historians. And it made me wonder whether we may have a little bit of a division in this room between those in the social sciences, perhaps the historians, perhaps the anthropologists, who don't have such a big conflict between their disciplinary identities and their China studies identities, and those in the political sciences, in the sociologies, that maybe experience more of a conflict. So that instead, the three of you have chosen topics that wrestle with identity in different ways. Madeline, interestingly, focuses on Levinson's ethnicity and focuses on cross-cultural issues. And I was very interested in the reference to the hippie days in this revolution talk of Joe's. And then Tim, talked a lot about teaching and the rub of teaching against research. And I could imagine your experiences transitioning from a PhD student at a research university to Colorado College. So sort of different kinds of identity being bound up in this this cause of producing knowledge about China. So if any of you want to reflect on that.
Okay. John Kennedy?
John Kennedy, no relation, from Kansas, not Boston. So my question is to Joe. And when I want to reflect a little bit, make this quick, but Mary makes a great point. When I teach Chinese politics, I start with the end of the Qing. The May 4th movement is extremely important, and we talk about continuations. And one thing, literature that I grabbed onto, and I do this in my teaching, and I really believe it from just my own research in rural China, especially in Shanbei and Northwest, is how the Cultural Revolution is being kind of recast and recast, but re-examined to talk about the positive aspects that happened in rural China. Looking at rural education, healthcare, barefoot doctors. I've even met barefoot doctors who remained in the village after reform because they felt they were doing something really good. And so how does that fit with this? And especially with gender and women. I mean, it seems like women, you had almost 45% of local government officials were women. You haven't had that many women in government since the Cultural Revolution, and reform has actually had a lesser representation of women in government offices from some of the work I've looked at and some of the statistics. So how would that fit with your notion of the revolution if they recast the Cultural Revolution? Would that kind of fit a little bit in your idea of things coming back, or at least showing how that continuation is important? Thanks.
Okay, very last comment. Go to Kevin and then back to the panel.
Hi, Kevin O'Brien, Berkeley. The more I hear from the political scientists in the audience here, the more I think that the place to go to learn about the revolution is a political science department right now, because I too start my class in 1898 with 100 Days Reform and move forward. And that's interesting, because in political science, if you want to learn about power, for example, that's the last place you would go. You'd go over to the humanities, because that's where you would learn about power. So it says something about transmogrification of disciplines over time. I have a broader methodological question suggested by Madeline's paper that we maybe can cut across the different panels. I was struck in your discussion of Levinson, who I read 10 years earlier than you, and would be absolutely mortified to have my professor sitting next to me as I was talking about it. I was particularly struck in your discussion about this comment about isolating the comparable and then probing failures of analogy. And I guess from a narrow-minded political scientist view, I tend to think of historians as people who are variation finders, is the way we would phrase it in political science. And unlike
Could you repeat that phrase?
Are variation finders. And it reminds me that Levinson had a different kind of relationship to variation finding and what somebody like Charles Tilly would call universalizing kind of research, where you take different kinds of things and show them to be more similar. And I guess what interests me about the way Levinson worked this territory is, at least in political science these days, in my department and many others, I think variation finding is very much in vogue. All the prospectuses I see are about hypotheses and very positivist and very much oriented to finding differences. But I was wondering, do you think Levinson gives us a different way about thinking about research, about bringing Jewish history and bringing China together in a promising way, but then at the same time troubling those analogies and not just coming up with parlor tricks of showing two things that are radically dissimilar are actually more similar than you think?
Okay, historians. Now, so we've been seriously challenged here. We have a profession that has gone, as Treitschke put it, to study wie es eigentlich gewesen ist, to becoming a group of variation finders. Tim, would you
My goodness.
like to respond?
I find that I'm troubled because I'm much more interested in Joe's paper and Madeline's paper than mine. Because I think there's the issues about what the revolution is. Jeremy's stepped out, but he did a paper at that other place, I believe, last month on the red. What was it called?
Legacy.
Red legacies, crimson legacies, which is the after effects and the after living effects of the Maoist revolution in China today. A student of mine just did her dissertation on the Maoist gender project in post-Mao. And all of them are, and from my own work, I see these after effects in Chinese intellectual work in Sixiang Wen-ti. So I think for most historians, anthropologists, sociologists, I think have a certain amount of picking up on this connection with the revolution, not as a dialectic opposite, but as, and of course amongst Chinese intellectuals, the new left, Cai Zhiyan and Wang Hui and others, try to reconsider in ways. Mind you, Gao Hua, whose father was a rightist, I mean, he's not happy. He's not a happy camper, and the story he has to tell is not a happy story. So, it's good, it's Dou Yan Hua. You're getting, multiple stories out of it. What I'm most struck, though, is Wen-hsin's comment about material forms and discursive expressions thereof. That's even better than the Carnegie stuff. That's what I was trying to talk about. And so I don't think there's a lot we can talk about in the material that I presented, but just the gentle reminder that until we change the political economy, the wonderful conversations we're having will not change very much. Until the promotion and tenure criteria change, what we see is what we get. And we can talk about how much we want to talk about revolution or Joseph Levinson, which again I find more interesting, but we have to think collectively if we're going to change the political economy.
Joe.
An awful lot here, and clearly it's generational, yes. The issue is generational, but I think the points that several people have made here that even you of the younger generation have found that at least some of the political science that start before 1980 or something, that, part of the point that I would make is precisely because it is generational, and especially in the classroom, this is such ancient history to them that they have to be reminded that it happened, that China just wasn't always reform and booming economy and so on and so forth, and try to figure out what the nature of that relationship was, and more than just a relationship of opposites, that it is, dialectical, if not even dialogic, in many ways. I don't even know where to begin with Wen-hsin's comments, because she's, as usual, stated it with such elegance and complexity that I'm not sure how to even engage that. She does make the point, I think, very properly and powerfully that, there was a revolution in Shanghai, too, and Shanghai had something to do with the revolution. And my Shanghai Revolution dichotomy, reads out Liz Perry. It reads out provincial passages, probably to some degree. That's a failing of a short presentation of this. But also I think it raises the larger question of trying to find ways that we can integrate those different histories. Certainly my point is not that the history that's been written about Shanghai is not worth reading or not important, but that we also need to see it as something that's not separate from stories that are going on elsewhere, in other cities, in the rural areas, and to try and understand those connections and those relationships in all of their complexities. John Kennedy's point, of course, reminds me of our times together in Shanbei. I think I first brought him to Shanbei. He's never left, and I appreciate that. But I do think the point that you make, that the memory, even of the Cultural Revolution, is different in some of these isolated rural areas, and we need to integrate that into the story as well. We need to understand how that worked. But finally, I just, on the question of sort of identity as historians, and what we're trying to do methodologically and as scholars, I want to come back really to something that Madeline said in her paper, and to reflect on, again, on Joseph Levinson, again, as, am I the only Levinson student in this room? So I can say all kinds of things and not be challenged. But of course, I came here to study with Levinson, and I was leaving Harvard because I felt that I already knew what the answers were to any question that Fairbank might ask, because it was and it was only one answer if you were going to get through. And I'd heard it enough, and I thought I had the gist of it. But when I came, actually during a spring break, since I am a Californian, to talk to Joseph Levinson, I was just absolutely taken with it, because I didn't know the answer to any of the questions that he was asking, or after I asked them of him, then I didn't know what the question meant or what the answer meant. And it was much more open-ended, but also And this was something that I was struck with by Levinson and that I've tried to hold as part of what it means to be a historian. He was incredibly self-conscious about what he was doing. And I think that Madeline's paper brings that up wonderfully. His Jewish identity was very important to him, but it was not just something that was producing a template that he was then going to use to understand China. It was something that he was constantly interrogating, as he was interrogating every assumption or every hypothesis or every idea that he had. And where was it that he came to that understanding, and where was it that he came to that notion? And did it come from his Jewish identity? Did it come from his Harvard training? Did it come there? What am I bringing to this which is just a bias in some way? What am I bringing to it that is an insight? And that sense of constantly questioning oneself rather than bringing a theory that is going to be the answer to our understanding of China was, it seems to me, fundamental to what Levinson was all about, and something that I hope we as historians are always doing, as we're always questioning just where it is that we're coming from and what it is that we're doing.
Madeline?
Thanks for Joe. That's very insightful. I'm glad you mentioned Tilly. I actually, when I was reading Levinson, I started reading Charles Tilly again and realized that how different they indeed are. And the question, maybe I don't know how to answer these questions individually. Maybe I'll pull them together in terms of questioning ourselves. Yes, we produce knowledge about China, but what does that mean? What exactly is it that we produce? Do we produce objective truth? What we find, is it the same as what physicists find, chemists find, biologists find? Or is it something else that we produce that we in general call knowledge? But the meaning of this word knowledge can be extremely vague. I think this is, I really hesitate saying this because I might get torn apart, because I feel that what we produce is not just knowledge. We do produce knowing. We produce understanding, but we also produce value. And values that are new after our study than before we start a project, because what we study as historians and as social scientists are real people. They're not things. So this rank school of scientific history of trying to match up truth and reality and facts really doesn't work for us. And so what Levinson did was actually, it's also in general dialogic history, is you seek common ground. And in that common ground, you don't objectify other people. So in some ways, seeking objective truth, you objectivize your objects of study. And so on that common ground, what is emphasized is equal relationship. It's an invitation for dialogue, and you treat the other people as a partner in dialogue. Tim we were making jokes about this story that every China studies person knows that the absent person became the rightist, right, during the anti-rightist movement. So what we do is, in fact, should be that you treat whom you study as a you, present in the room, the person that you talk to, rather than an absent he that you can make into a rightist that you don't want to be. So it's what we learn from that kind of conversation and dialogue is, if you imagine yourself in the relationship of conversation dialogue, what you learn is not only so-called objective truth about this third person he, but also about yourself. Here is my dilemma, here is my problem, and this is what I think, so what do you think? So you learn about both. And so Levinson's didn't end his on choice of Jewish identity or trilogy on this emphasis on particularity or identity, because an overemphasis on identity and difference actually comes from this mainstream Western philosophy's stress on individuality. I think he came from different places. He started from this non-negotiable existence of the singular. Everyone, every different culture had the right to exist, and you don't need to justify that. It should exist. And then after that, you can think about the universal, and the universal can only be built from that. Of course, Levinson carried with him all the limitations and dilemmas of that humanistic project of his generation, but that's where he come from, that the emphasis is not on the individual, on differences. Of course, he started from differences, but he located the differences in the network of relations. So here is why Martin Buber and Whitehead mattered, in the sense that their understanding of the human being and human society, humans can only be defined in relationships. You cannot be defined by oneself. And his study of Liang Qichao, actually, today you mentioned Liang Qichao, I tried this with a few colleagues. The response I got is, oh, who's going to read Levinson's book on Liang Qichao anymore? It's so limited. There's so many new things that you can read. Nobody reads that anymore. But I read it, and I realized that he took Liang Qichao as an inspiration. He didn't just studied Liang Qichao. So actually, his historical dialogue started with his project of Liang Qichao. And then the question, I thought, the Chinese actually today still use Liang Qichao to understand the world. They use Liang Qichao for about a century to understand the world. Why would it be such a terrible thing if Levinson did that? And we don't use Liang Qichao to understand the world. We don't use Lu Xun to understand the world. It seems like we can only study them as objects. And if you don't study them as objects, as Levinson did, the criticism he got actually on his book on Liang Qichao and on the trilogy is that he was not objective enough, not empirical enough. So.
Okay, we have time for just a few. Any questions on this side? Jeremy Barnet? Okay. Start with Professor Barmet, and then over on this side, please.
I'm Jeremy Barmet. Just, if I may, observe about the abiding legacy of revolution in China today, and that is that much of the discourse of revolutionary society, harmony aside, has been transferred into the international realm. Because after all, the Communist Party still speaks to itself internally in a highly extremist, revolutionary, discursive fashion. And it's externalized class struggle and the whole discursive terrain of the Maoist era onto the international landscape, especially if one reads contemporary Chinese newspapers or party documents, or perhaps indulges in reading the Global Times, which is always a source of great humor. But if you read internal party discussions of international relations, the revolutionary landscape of the past is alive and well. So I'd say that the revolution still hasn't died, it continues to live, but just in a very dramatic and externalized form.
Yes, over on this side, please.
Turn it back over to me for some details.
Yeah, hold on.
I'm Lotus Yifong, and I think we're the first Chinese Americans back in China in '71, and then our family was the first AT&T family in '87. So my husband negotiated the Guoji Changju Dianhua. And so over the years, besides family and watching the different stages, I just want to bring up for your future students, I was at the Harvard China Review Conference after I went to the Chinese Language Conference in San Francisco. And these teachers and their students are the up-and-coming bilingual, getting Mandarin immersion from K to 12, visiting China in middle school as well as high school. And I'm sure that they will be students of whatever department is funded, politically funded, and I would suggest that their parents are very motivated to provide tuition that goes in the direction for this research. So our experience of the first 30 years followed of revolution is that there are some historical visuals that help young people. I find the documentaries are helpful, and one was called The Dragon and the Eagle, produced by Jim Culp, who gives the history of the first Americans in China. And for some reason, PBS never saw fit to air this documentary, but it helps bring to life that China trade period for the young ones. And then more recently, I actually saw it here, Yan Ban Shi, the cultural revolutionary operas that were done from the government perspective. And but I think for young people, it's helpful because they have the grandchildren and children interviewing the people who were in those original revolutionary operas. So I think the other dilemma about teaching the departments and the disciplines is I see the economy, the global economy, moving so fast into this green tech, clean tech, and the new I guess, shifting of economics through the world, that people are looking at the business schools, they're looking at the engineering and IT fields. So the money is going very fast into venture capital in China and Asia, and how to link the knowledge that you and your students can provide with the people who are really looking to shape the new economy and could use some social science perspective to appreciate what's happened so fast in the changes between revolution and reform. And the last thing I tell young Chinese who are born after Cultural Revolution is that Marx was a German living in London studying the Industrial Revolution that produced child labor in China. So I think, you know, kind of trying to diffuse this bugaboo about communism because China was so confused with Soviet Russia. And I think Chinese deserve to study the revolution based on what the Chinese people did.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. We're at the end of our time here, and it's been a very stimulating panel. I think one final takeaway, Tim's great concern about the future political economy of the profession. Keep in mind Madeline's warning on this. This is for younger scholars in the audience. You should go to that next department meeting because you never know when there will be a quota for rightists. Let me turn this back to Kevin O'Brien.
Let me just close up by suggesting a couple linkages between this panel and the largely political science panel that's going to follow. I mean, coming out of Madeline Dong's and Joe Esherick's paper, I guess one of the things that struck me more than anything is that political scientists who work on China are focused very much on Levinson's internal crises. And while historians may be running off to look at the global, it's actually striking how few political scientists have. And it may be because of the way our departments are organized, that most of us come out of comparative politics, not so many out of international relations. But it's really just in the last few years that the international factors are infiltrating their way in to looking at what goes on in Chinese politics. The other thing that caught my attention is that if Joe is right, that historians like Wen-hsin and like hundreds of millions of migrant workers have flocked to the cities, political scientists to a large extent have been sent down to the basic level. Most of us have been working on local issues for quite a while now. And it's actually quite striking. So when Joe said that Chinese studies is not preoccupied with rural villages, I'm quite sure that a lot of my colleagues in political science think it is preoccupied with rural villages, and we should get on with what's going on in the cities to a greater extent. Now, one similarity between what's going on in history and political science that caught my attention is Tim Cheek's discussion about troubling over the relationship between area studies and the discipline. This is something that's very much going on in political science. I think there may be some kind of resolution that's coming. We don't have nearly as many people saying, like a president of the APSA said a few years ago, that having an area studies specialist a specialist on individual countries in every political science department is just as odd as having a specialist on every planet in an astronomy department. 10 or 15 years ago, there were people saying things like that. I think there's been a piece that's being worked out, and I hope in this next panel that we'll be talking about it. And part of it we'll be looking at people like John Kennedy, who's looking at a whole new area, a whole new notion of area studies, that is area studies done by those people who live in that area, not only in China, but precisely in that area. On a couple administrative points, we are going to have a change in the next panel. Peter Lawrenson has had a family emergency and has had to leave, so Hans Steinmuller is going to be stepping in, and I think will fit in quite well with John Kennedy's paper. And then for lunch, the invited paper presenters will be meeting here in a room right behind us to have lunch for the next hour 45, and we welcome everybody to return at 1:15 for our next panel.